In the year 1277, a papal envoy arrived at a remote fortress in the mountains of southern France. What he discovered inside those stone walls was so horrifying, so blasphemous, that he immediately sealed every entrance with blessed iron and ordered the entire structure burned to ash. But before the flames consumed everything, he confiscated a single manuscript, a document that would remain locked in the Vatican's secret archives for the next 700 years. That manuscript contained the names, rituals, and true purpose of an order that officially never existed: the Black Knights. While Europe celebrated the glory of the Templars and chronicled the deeds of the Hospitallers, another brotherhood operated in absolute darkness. They wore no white crosses, built no grand cathedrals, and left no records in official histories. Instead, they moved through medieval courts like shadows, counseling kings in whispered conversations, orchestrating political murders that changed the course of nations, and guarding knowledge so dangerous that mere possession of it warranted immediate execution. Their castles stood in forgotten valleys. Their ceremonies took place under moonless skies, and their members swore oaths of silence enforced by methods that made even hardened knights tremble with fear. The church hunted them with a fury reserved only for the most existential threats, not because they were heretics or traitors, but because they knew something so fundamentally transformative that its revelation would have shattered the foundations of medieval power itself. In a single coordinated purge spanning 72 hours, thousands of Black Knights vanished from history. Their fortresses were razed, their documents burned, their very names erased from every chronicle and record. But erasure is not the same as extinction, and silence does not always mean death. Imagine for a moment that beneath the most photographed monument on Earth, there exists a chamber that would rewrite everything you know about human civilization. Not a theory, not speculation, a documented reality that has been systematically hidden from you for 800 years. The Knights Templar discovered this chamber in 1123, and what they found inside was so devastating to the established narrative of history that it required their complete extermination. You have been taught that the Templars were arrested for heresy, for spitting on the cross, for worshipping false idols. That is a lie. They were destroyed because they discovered proof that the Pyramids of Egypt contain secrets far older and far more dangerous than any pharaoh. Here is what they never taught you in school. In the year 1118, 12 Templar knights arrived in Cairo with maps. Not Crusader maps, not Byzantine maps. Maps drawn in a script that predated hieroglyphics. These maps showed precise locations of entrance points beneath the Giza Plateau, tunnels that connected the three great pyramids through an underground network that official Egyptology still refuses to acknowledge exists. For 6 years, these knights conducted excavations in absolute secrecy, protected by arrangements made with local authorities whose cooperation was purchased with Templar gold. They descended into chambers that had been sealed for thousands of years, chambers containing artifacts and manuscripts that contradicted the entire timeline of human history. And then, in 1124, they stopped. They sealed the entrance they had opened. They returned to Europe, and they never spoke publicly about what they had seen. But they did write it down, in coded manuscripts, in encrypted letters sent between Templar strongholds across Europe, in confession documents sealed by bishops who were themselves Templars. And here is the brutal truth that your history teachers never mentioned. Of the estimated 23,000 written documents produced by the Templars during their 200-year existence, fewer than 600 survive today. The rest were deliberately destroyed, burned in coordinated fires across France on a single night in October 1307. confiscated by the Inquisition and locked in Vatican archives that remain sealed to this day. Erased so thoroughly that historians teach you the Templars kept poor records. They kept meticulous records. Someone made sure you would never read them. Let that number sink into your consciousness. For every single page you can read about the Templars in any library, in any university, in any museum on Earth, there are 37 pages that were intentionally destroyed. 37 pieces of evidence burned. 37 witnesses to history silenced. You live in a world where 97% of what the Templars knew has been systematically erased from human knowledge. And what was worth erasing on that scale? What single piece of information justified the arrest of 15,000 men simultaneously across 12 countries? What truth required the torture of thousands, the execution of hundreds, the complete annihilation of the most powerful military order in Christendom? The answer lies in Egypt, in chambers beneath monuments that were already ancient when Moses was born. The official timeline teaches you that the Great Pyramid was built in 2560 before Christ by Pharaoh Khufu as a tomb. Egyptologists will tell you with absolute certainty that it took 20 years to build, that it contains 2,300,000 limestone blocks, that it was the tallest structure on Earth for 3,800 years. They will show you hieroglyphics. They will cite carbon dating. They will present archaeological evidence that appears conclusive. And all of it is designed to make you stop asking the one question that terrifies them. How did a civilization without steel tools, without the wheel, without advanced mathematics, create a structure so perfectly aligned to true north that modern engineers cannot replicate it? The Templars asked that question, and they found the answer in the chambers below. What they discovered was not Egyptian. It was older than Egypt. It was evidence of a civilization that possessed knowledge the modern world is only beginning to rediscover. Knowledge of astronomy so precise they mapped stellar alignments that would not be visible for another 12,000 years. Knowledge of geology that allowed them to cut and move stones weighing 70 tons with tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. Knowledge of mathematics that encoded the dimensions of the Earth itself into the architecture of the pyramids. And most disturbing of all, knowledge of human history that contradicted everything the Church taught about the age of civilization, about the origins of mankind, about the timeline of the Bible itself. This is why the Templars became a threat. Not because they worshipped Baphomet, not because they denied Christ, not because they engaged in heretical rituals. Those were the charges fabricated to justify their destruction. The real reason was far simpler and far more dangerous. They had proof that the Church was teaching a false history. They had manuscripts, artifacts, and inscriptions that showed human civilization was far older, far more advanced, and far more mysterious than the official narrative allowed. They had evidence that would collapse the entire foundation upon which papal authority rested. And they made the fatal mistake of letting the wrong people know they possessed this evidence. Philippe IV of France, the king who orchestrated the Templar arrests, was bankrupt. His treasury was empty. He owed the Templars enormous sums of money he could not repay. The official histories will tell you this was his motive: greed, debt, political expediency. But Philip was no fool. He was one of the most cunning monarchs in European history, a man who successfully challenged the authority of the Pope himself. He did not destroy the Templars simply to cancel his debts. He could have done that with far less spectacle. No, Philip destroyed the Templars because they told him what they had found in Egypt. And he understood, with absolute clarity, that this knowledge represented a threat to the entire structure of medieval power. The Church controlled the narrative of history. Anyone who could prove that narrative false controlled the future. So he made a deal with Pope Clement V. Simultaneous arrests across Europe, coordinated seizures of all Templar properties, all Templar archives, all Templar treasures. Interrogations under torture designed not to extract confessions of heresy, but to locate every copy of the Egyptian documents. Every knight who knew what lay beneath Giza. Every manuscript that contained proof of what they had discovered. And then, systematic extermination. Not of guilty men, of witnesses, of anyone who could testify to what had been found beneath the sand. But 18 ships escaped, Templar galleys that sailed from La Rochelle on the night of October 12, 1307, hours before the arrests began. They carried the most important documents, the most vital artifacts, the most dangerous secrets, and they disappeared. Official history claims these ships sailed to Scotland, to Portugal, to Cyprus. But there is another possibility that historians refuse to consider. What if they sailed back to Egypt? What if the evidence the Templars discovered never left the chambers beneath Giza? What if it is still there, waiting in the darkness, guarded by silence and sand and the willful ignorance of archaeologists who fear what acknowledgement would mean? You have been taught to trust experts, to believe that if something important existed, the scientists would have found it. The archaeologists would have excavated it. The historians would have documented it. But what if the experts are not searching because they already know what is there? What if the chambers beneath the Sphinx, beneath the pyramids, beneath the entire Giza plateau remain officially unexplored, not because of lack of funding or lack of technology, but because those who control access to these sites understand exactly what would be found? What if the greatest archaeological discovery in human history has already been made, documented, and deliberately suppressed for 8 centuries? The Templars knew. They descended into those chambers in 1123. They spent months exploring passages that connected monuments built thousands of years apart. They found inscriptions in languages that should not exist. They discovered artifacts that demonstrated technological capabilities that ancient Egyptians supposedly did not possess. They gathered evidence that proved beyond any doubt that the official timeline of human civilization was fundamentally wrong. And for that knowledge, for that evidence, for that truth, 9,000 knights were destroyed. Their libraries were burned. Their names were erased. Their order was annihilated. Because some truths are too dangerous to be allowed to survive. This is the secret buried under the sand. Not treasure, not gold, not religious relics. Knowledge. Proof of human history that predates the flood, that contradicts Genesis, that demonstrates civilizations rose and fell long before Adam was supposed to have been created. Evidence that would shatter the foundational mythology upon which Western civilization was built. And 800 years later, that evidence remains buried, deliberately hidden, systematically denied, protected by institutions that understand perfectly well that acknowledgement would require them to admit they have been lying to you about the origins of humanity since the day you were born. In the spring of 1118, 12 knights arrived in Cairo wearing white mantles marked with red crosses. Official records state they came to establish a Templar presence in Egypt to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem, to strengthen Crusader positions in the Holy Land. These records are lies. The 12 knights who dismounted their horses on the dusty streets of Cairo that April morning had not come to protect anyone. They had come searching for something specific, something they had been told existed beneath monuments that had stood for 3,000 years. And the man who sent them knew exactly what they would find, because someone had drawn him a map. His name was Hugues de Payens, Grand Master of the Knights Templar, co-founder of the order itself. In 1119, 9 years before the Cairo expedition, Hugues had been present at a private meeting in Jerusalem with a scholar whose name was deliberately erased from every historical record. This scholar possessed documents written in languages that should not have existed in the 12th century. Documents that described in precise detail the layout of chambers beneath the Giza plateau. Documents that explained what these chambers contained and why they had been sealed. And most importantly, documents that warned what would happen to any man who descended into those chambers unprepared for what he would witness. Hugues read these documents. He understood their implications, and he made the decision that would doom his order to extinction. The 12 knights sent to Cairo were not random selections. They were chosen specifically for their psychological resilience, their absolute loyalty to Hugues, and their willingness to keep secrets even under torture. 6 of them were combat veterans who had survived the siege of Jerusalem. 3 were scholars fluent in Arabic and Hebrew. 2 were engineers trained in military fortification. 1 was a physician experienced in treating madness. This was not a diplomatic mission. This was an expedition into unknown territory, where men were expected to encounter things that would break their minds. Hugues knew this because the documents he possessed had warned him explicitly. They described what previous explorers had experienced. They listed symptoms: insomnia, paranoia, religious crisis, complete psychological collapse. And they explained that these symptoms were not weakness. They were the rational response of a human mind confronting evidence that reality was not what it appeared to be. The official story is that these knights spent their time in Cairo establishing trade relationships and coordinating with local Crusader forces. The truth is, they spent 6 months excavating. They hired local workers who were paid 3 times the normal wage and sworn to secrecy under threat of death. They worked exclusively at night when the desert was empty and Egyptian authorities were not watching. They descended through an entrance point located precisely where the ancient documents said it would be, beneath the southeastern corner of the Great Pyramid, accessed through a natural limestone cave that connected to man-made passages carved thousands of years before. And what they found in those passages confirmed everything the documents had promised. It also destroyed everything these men believed about history, about civilization, about God himself. The first chamber they entered was 30 feet below the desert surface. The walls were covered in inscriptions that none of them could read, symbols that resembled hieroglyphics, but predated any known Egyptian script. The engineering was impossibly precise. Blocks of limestone weighing several tons, fitted together with gaps so narrow a knife blade could not penetrate between them. No mortar, no binding material. Just stone cut and placed with accuracy that modern stonemasons cannot replicate even with laser-guided equipment. And the chamber was not empty. It contained artifacts, objects made from materials that did not corrode, did not decay, did not age. Metallic alloys that none of the knights recognized. Crystal formations that emitted faint light in absolute darkness. And manuscripts. Scrolls preserved in conditions so perfect they appeared to have been sealed yesterday, despite carbon residue that suggested they were thousands of years old. Brother Jean de Saint-Omer, the physician who accompanied the expedition, kept a private journal that survived the Templar purge, only because it was hidden inside a false wall in a French monastery. This journal was discovered in 1793 during the French Revolution, when the monastery was ransacked. It was read once by a revolutionary official who immediately ordered it resealed and hidden. It surfaced again briefly in 1847 when a scholar attempted to publish excerpts. The Vatican purchased the manuscript within days, and it has not been seen publicly since. But the scholar's notes survived, and they describe what Jean de Saint-Omer witnessed in those chambers beneath Cairo. He wrote that the artifacts they found demonstrated technological knowledge that should not have existed in the ancient world. He wrote that the manuscripts contained astronomical calculations predicting celestial events that would not occur for thousands of years, and he wrote that 3 of the 12 knights began experiencing psychological deterioration within weeks of entering the chambers. Brother Guillaume de Chartres was the first to break. He was one of the combat veterans, a man who had fought in 7 major battles without showing fear. But after descending into the second chamber, after witnessing what was carved into those walls, Guillaume stopped speaking. He would not eat. He would not sleep. He spent his nights staring at the desert sky as if searching for something he could not name. The other knights attempted to comfort him, to bring him back to rationality through prayer and medical treatment. But Guillaume was beyond comfort. He had seen something in those chambers that contradicted his entire understanding of God's creation, and his mind could not reconcile what he believed with what he knew to be true. 3 weeks after his breakdown began, Guillaume walked into the desert alone. His body was never found. Brother Archambault de Saint-Amand lasted longer. He was one of the scholars, a man who read Hebrew and Arabic fluently, who had studied at the finest universities in Europe. Archambaud was assigned to translate the manuscripts they found in the chambers, and what he translated destroyed him more thoroughly than any physical torture could have achieved. The manuscripts described the builders of the pyramids, not as primitive stoneworkers guided by slave labor and copper tools, but as inheritors of knowledge passed down from a civilization that existed thousands of years before Egypt, a civilization that possessed understanding of mathematics and astronomy and engineering that exceeded anything the medieval world could comprehend. The manuscripts claimed that the Great Pyramid was not a tomb, it was a repository, a vault designed to preserve knowledge through a cataclysm that would destroy the civilization that built it. And the cataclysm had already occurred, 12,000 years before Christ was born. Archambaud spent 43 days translating these texts. His fellow knights watched him deteriorate. He stopped attending prayer services. He refused to touch the Bible. When questioned about his loss of faith, he replied that faith was irrelevant when confronted with documented proof that human history was fundamentally different from what the Church taught. The other scholars attempted to debate him, to bring him back to Christian orthodoxy through theological argument. But Archambaud would not debate. He would only repeat the facts he had translated. The pyramids were older than believed. The builders possessed knowledge that contradicted Genesis. The timeline of civilization taught by the Church was demonstrably false. And if the Church was wrong about the age of the world, what else were they wrong about? What other lies formed the foundation of Christian doctrine? On the 67th day of the expedition, Archambaud de Saint-Amand sealed himself inside the chamber where the manuscripts were stored. He took with him a week's worth of food and water. He told the other knights he needed solitude to complete his translation work. When they opened the chamber 7 days later, they found Archambaud dead. He had not starved. He had not dehydrated. The medical examination showed no signs of violence or disease. His heart had simply stopped, and scattered around his body were pages of translation, hundreds of pages detailing what the manuscripts contained. The knights gathered these pages carefully. They sealed them in waterproof containers, and they made a decision that would define the rest of Templar history. This knowledge was too dangerous to be destroyed, but it was also too dangerous to be revealed. So they would hide it. They would guard it. They would create an entire secret hierarchy within the Templar order, dedicated to protecting these documents from discovery. And they would never, under any circumstances, allow the Church to learn what they had found beneath the Egyptian sand. The expedition ended in November 1118. 9 knights returned to Europe. 3 had been lost in Egypt, 1 to madness, 1 to despair, 1 to mysterious death. The survivors carried with them copies of the manuscripts, sketches of the artifacts, detailed maps of the chamber system beneath Giza, and they carried something else. A conviction that everything they had been taught about human history was a carefully constructed lie. This conviction would spread through the upper ranks of the Templar order like a virus. It would transform the Templars from simple warrior monks into guardians of forbidden knowledge, and it would guarantee their eventual destruction because men who know the truth are always dangerous to institutions built on deception. Hugues de Payan died in 1136, 18 years after sending those 12 knights to Cairo. On his deathbed, he confessed to the Templar Grand Prior that the Egyptian expedition had been the greatest mistake of his life, not because it had failed, but because it had succeeded. The knowledge they had discovered could never be unknown. The truth they had witnessed could never be forgotten. And the Church would never forgive them for possessing evidence that contradicted papal authority. Hugues understood that he had condemned his order to eventual annihilation, but he also understood that the knowledge had to be preserved, that someone, somewhere, in some future age, would need to know that human civilization was far older and far stranger than official history admitted. So he made his successor swear an oath. The documents would be protected, the truth would be guarded, and if the order fell, if the Templars were destroyed, the evidence would be hidden so well that only those worthy of finding it would ever succeed. Beneath the left paw of the Sphinx, there exists an entrance that appears in no official archaeological survey. It was photographed once in 1926 by a British engineer named Thomas Danley, who was mapping underground water channels near Giza. His photograph shows a rectangular opening carved into bedrock, descending at a 45-degree angle into darkness. The photograph was confiscated by Egyptian authorities within hours of its development. Danley was expelled from Egypt and forbidden from returning. When he attempted to publish his findings in 1928, his manuscript was rejected by every academic journal in Europe. He died in 1933 under circumstances officially ruled as accidental drowning, though he was found in a bathtub in a London hotel room locked from the outside. The photograph resurfaced briefly in 1947, was authenticated by 3 independent experts, then vanished permanently into private collections. But the Templars knew about that entrance 700 years before Danley took his photograph. In 1123, 5 years after the initial Cairo expedition, a second group of Templar knights returned to Giza. This time they brought specialized equipment. Ropes rated to support the weight of armored men. Torches designed to burn for extended periods in oxygen-depleted environments. medical supplies for treating injuries sustained in confined spaces, and most tellingly, they brought a scholar who had spent 3 years learning to read the script found in the chambers discovered during the first expedition. His name was Brother Bertrand de Blanchefort, and he would later become the 6th Grand Master of the Templar Order. But in 1123, he was simply a 32-year-old monk who had sacrificed his sanity to understand a language that should not have existed. What Bertrand had learned from translating those ancient texts was that the chambers beneath the Great Pyramid were not the primary repository. They were merely an antechamber. The real vault lay deeper, beneath the Sphinx itself, accessed through passages that connected to a network of tunnels extending for miles beneath the entire Giza plateau. The descent took 6 hours. The tunnel was precisely 4 feet wide and 6 feet high, forcing the knights to move in single file, bent at the waist, breathing air that grew thinner with every step downward. The walls were carved from solid limestone with a precision that defied explanation. No tool marks, no irregularities. Just perfectly smooth stone cut at exact angles that modern engineers would require laser guidance to replicate. And carved into those walls, at regular intervals of exactly 23 feet, were symbols. The same symbols Bertrand had spent 3 years learning to read. And they were not decorative. They were warnings. Each symbol described what lay ahead. Each inscription detailed what the explorers would encounter, and each warning grew more explicit about the psychological danger of continuing. But the Templars did not turn back. They had traveled too far and sacrificed too much to retreat, based on ancient warnings carved by people who had been dust for millennia. The first chamber they reached was 140 feet beneath the desert surface. It was circular, approximately 60 feet in diameter, with a domed ceiling that rose another 30 feet above them. The engineering required to excavate such a space without collapse was beyond anything the ancient Egyptians supposedly possessed. No support columns, no reinforcement structures, just a perfect dome carved from bedrock that had supported its own weight for thousands of years, and covering every inch of that dome were astronomical charts. Not primitive star maps, not crude representations of constellations. Precise mathematical diagrams showing the position of stars as they would appear 12,900 years before the birth of Christ. The Templars knew these were astronomical charts because Bertrand could read the annotations. He could translate the calculations, and those calculations demonstrated knowledge of celestial mechanics that would not be rediscovered by European astronomers for another 600 years. But the astronomical charts were not what broke the minds of the knights who witnessed them. What destroyed their psychological equilibrium was the realization that these charts were predictions. They showed future positions of stars. They mapped celestial events that had not yet occurred. They demonstrated that whoever created these chambers possessed the mathematical capability to calculate planetary orbits thousands of years in advance, and they included dates. Specific dates written in a calendar system that Bertrand could translate into the Christian calendar. Dates that corresponded to events in human history that had not yet happened when these chambers were sealed. The fall of Rome, the rise of Islam, the Crusades themselves, all predicted with precision that suggested either impossible astronomical knowledge or access to information about the future that violated every principle of causality the medieval mind could comprehend. Brother Geoffroy de Saint-Omer, nephew of the Jean de Saint-Omer, who had died during the first expedition, was the military commander of this second venture. He was a pragmatic man, trained in warfare and engineering, skeptical of prophecy and mysticism. But when Bertrand translated the astronomical predictions and showed him that they accurately described events that had already occurred in Christian history, Geoffroy experienced what his private letters later described as a crisis of faith so profound that he considered suicide. The implications were unbearable. If ancient builders thousands of years before Christ could predict the future of human civilization with mathematical precision, then what did that say about free will? About divine providence? About the entire Christian doctrine of salvation through faith? These questions tormented Geoffroy for the remainder of his life. In 1307, when the Templar arrests began, Geoffroy de Saint-Omer was 73 years old. He refused to flee. He submitted to arrest voluntarily. And under torture, he confessed to heresy. Not because he was guilty, but because he no longer believed confession meant anything in a universe where the future had already been calculated and carved into stone 12,000 years before Christ walked the earth. The second chamber was deeper. It required another 4 hours of descent through passages that grew increasingly narrow and increasingly decorated with warnings that Bertrand translated with growing dread. The warnings described psychological effects, disorientation, loss of temporal perception, inability to distinguish memory from prophecy, and they explained that these effects were not supernatural. They were the natural consequence of human consciousness encountering evidence that contradicted its fundamental assumptions about reality. The warnings recommended retreat. They suggested that knowledge of what lay ahead was not worth the permanent damage to human sanity that comprehension would require. But the Templars interpreted these warnings as tests, challenges designed to filter the worthy from the unworthy. Obstacles that true seekers of knowledge were meant to overcome through faith and determination. This interpretation was catastrophically wrong. The chamber they discovered, at the end of that second descent, contained artifacts that should not have existed in any historical period. Objects manufactured from alloys that required metallurgical knowledge not rediscovered until the 20th century. Crystalline structures that generated light without heat, without fuel, without any visible power source. And most disturbing of all, mechanisms. Devices constructed from materials the Templars could not identify, serving purposes they could not comprehend. One of these mechanisms was approximately the size of a human torso, composed of interlocking gears made from a metal that did not corrode, did not tarnish, did not show any signs of age despite obvious antiquity. The gears were inscribed with the same astronomical symbols that covered the dome of the first chamber. And when Bertrand attempted to manipulate the mechanism, when he rotated one of the larger gears exactly one complete revolution, the entire device activated. What happened next is described in multiple Templar documents with remarkable consistency. The mechanism began to emit sound, not mechanical noise, not grinding or clicking, but a tone, a pure harmonic frequency that resonated through the chamber and through the bodies of the knights who stood witnessing it. And as the tone continued, as the frequency intensified, the knights began to experience what they later described as visions. Images appearing in their minds with clarity that exceeded normal memory. Images of events that had not occurred. Cities that did not exist. Technologies that had no names in any language they knew. And interspersed with these visions of the impossible future were visions of the impossible past. Civilizations rising from nothing. Monuments being constructed by methods that defied physics. And cataclysms, floods and fires and catastrophes that erased entire continents from existence. leaving only fragments of knowledge preserved in chambers like the one where they now stood. Brother Bertrand de Blanchefort collapsed. The other knights carried him to the surface, a journey that took 14 hours because Bertrand could not walk, could not speak, could barely breathe. For 6 days he remained in a state that the Templar physician described as waking coma. His eyes were open, his body was alive, but his consciousness was absent, lost somewhere between the visions the mechanism had shown him and the reality he no longer recognized. When Bertrand finally recovered the ability to speak, his first words were a question. He asked whether he was still in the chamber. When told he had been brought to the surface, he asked how long he had been unconscious. When told 6 days, he insisted that was impossible. From his perspective, he had experienced 6 months. 6 months of visions showing him the entire span of human history from 12,000 years before Christ to an ending he could not bring himself to describe. The Templars sealed the entrance to the Sphinx chambers in November 1123. They filled the passage with rubble. They disguised the entrance so thoroughly that subsequent explorers would not recognize it as artificial. And they made a collective decision that the knowledge contained in those chambers was too dangerous for humanity to possess. Not because it was false, but because it was true. Because acceptance of that truth would require abandoning every comfortable lie civilization had constructed about its own history, its own importance, its own place in the cosmos. The Templars understood that humanity was not ready for that knowledge. Perhaps humanity would never be ready. But they also understood that the knowledge could not be destroyed. So they became its guardians. They created elaborate systems of coded manuscripts. They established secret hierarchies within their order dedicated to preserving information that could never be publicly revealed. And they waited. They waited for a future age when humanity might be capable of comprehending what lay beneath the Egyptian sand without losing its collective sanity in the process. That age has not yet arrived. In 1987, construction workers renovating a medieval church in southern France discovered something that should not have existed. Behind a false wall in the sacristy, sealed in a copper cylinder wrapped in oiled leather, they found a manuscript written in Latin on parchment that carbon dating would later confirm was 700 years old. The manuscript consisted of 43 pages of text accompanied by detailed technical drawings that demonstrated knowledge of Egyptian archaeology that would not be available to European scholars for another 6 centuries. The workers who discovered it contacted local authorities, who contacted archaeologists, who contacted the French Ministry of Culture, who within 72 hours transferred the manuscript to an undisclosed location where it remains to this day. But before it disappeared, 3 scholars were permitted to examine and photograph its contents. And what those scholars saw in those 43 pages rewrote everything they thought they knew about the Knights Templar and their relationship with ancient Egypt. The manuscript was written by Brother Guillaume de Sonnac, who served as Grand Master of the Knights Templar from 1247 to 1250. Guillaume was present during the 7th Crusade, was captured at the Battle of Mansoura, spent 2 years as a prisoner in Cairo, and died defending the Crusader fortress of Acre in 1250. Official histories record these facts with certainty. What they do not record is that during his 2 years of captivity in Cairo, Guillaume was permitted by his Egyptian captors to access the chambers beneath Giza, not as a concession to a defeated enemy, but because Guillaume possessed information that the Egyptians wanted. He carried with him copies of the translations Bertrand de Blanchefort had made of the ancient inscriptions. and certain Egyptian scholars, members of mystical orders that predated Islam, recognized those translations as authentic. They had been searching for the chambers themselves for generations. Guillaume offered them a trade: access to the chambers in exchange for his freedom and the freedom of 50 Templar knights held prisoner with him. The Egyptians accepted. What Guillaume de Sonnac documented in his manuscript was a complete chronology of what the Templars had discovered beneath the Egyptian sand across 130 years of secret exploration. The first expedition in 1118, the second in 1123, and 7 additional expeditions between 1130 and 1248 that were never recorded in any official Templar document. Each expedition descended deeper into the network of chambers. Each discovered artifacts and manuscripts that contradicted accepted history more fundamentally than the last. And each expedition lost men. Not to accidents, not to disease, but to what Guillaume described as enlightenment psychosis. The condition that occurred when a human mind trained in medieval Christian doctrine encountered proof so overwhelming, so undeniable, so completely contradictory to everything it believed, that consciousness itself fractured under the strain of trying to maintain 2 incompatible versions of reality simultaneously. The manuscript contained drawings, technical schematics of the chambers beneath the Sphinx, precise measurements of passage dimensions, detailed maps showing the connection between underground networks beneath all 3 pyramids, and most remarkably, accurate drawings of hieroglyphic cartouches that would not be discovered by modern Egyptologists until 1922, when Howard Carter opened the tomb of Tutankhamun. Guillaume had copied these cartouches from chamber walls in 1248. He had drawn them with such precision that when the manuscript was examined in 1987, scholars immediately recognized them as authentic. But Guillaume could not have seen these specific cartouches. The chambers where they existed were supposedly sealed and undiscovered until the 20th century. Unless Guillaume was telling the truth, unless the Templars had found and explored those chambers 7 centuries before, modern archaeology claimed they were opened for the first time. Page 17 of the manuscript contained what Guillaume called the chronology of impossibility. It was a list, a catalogue of artifacts discovered in the chambers, organized by the expedition that found them, dated according to the Christian calendar, and described in detail that made clear Guillaume understood exactly how impossible these objects were. The list began with items from the 1118 expedition. Manuscripts written in pre-hieroglyphic script describing astronomical observations made 12,000 years before Christ. Metallic tools manufactured from alloys that would not be developed until the 20th century. Crystal lenses ground with optical precision that exceeded anything medieval craftsmen could produce, and it progressed through increasingly impossible discoveries. By the 1248 expedition, the Templars were documenting mechanical devices that Guillaume described as self-operating, meaning they functioned without human intervention, without visible power sources, serving purposes he could not comprehend. But the most disturbing section of the manuscript was not the catalogue of artifacts. It was page 31, where Guillaume documented what he called the Chamber of Origins. This chamber was located deeper than any previous Templar expedition had descended, accessed through a passage so narrow that knights had to remove their armor and crawl single file for more than an hour through absolute darkness. What they found at the end of that crawl was a room carved from bedrock that contained a single massive stone tablet. The tablet was covered in inscriptions that Guillaume could not fully translate, but the portions he could read were specific enough to send him into the same crisis of faith that had destroyed so many Templars before him. The inscriptions described the builders of the pyramids, not as Egyptians, not as any civilization known to history, but as survivors. Refugees from a cataclysm that had destroyed their original homeland, carrying with them fragments of knowledge from a civilization that had achieved technological capabilities humanity would not rediscover for millennia. The tablet described this lost civilization in detail that made Guillaume question whether he was reading history or prophecy. It spoke of cities that floated on water, of vessels that traveled beneath the ocean, of devices that could transmit human voice across vast distances instantaneously, of weapons that could destroy entire cities in moments. And it explained that this civilization had destroyed itself, not through natural disaster, through war, through the weaponization of knowledge that should have been used for enlightenment. The survivors who built the pyramids were determined that their mistake would not be repeated, so they encoded their knowledge in monuments so massive they would survive any future cataclysm. They created chambers deep enough to protect artifacts from destruction, and they left warnings carved in stone, explaining that humanity was not ready for this knowledge, would not be ready for thousands of years, perhaps would never be ready. But the knowledge had to be preserved because the cycle would repeat. Civilization would rise. It would achieve technological capability, and it would face the same choice. Use that capability for enlightenment or for annihilation. Guillaume de Sonac wrote that reading this tablet changed him permanently. He stopped believing in the divine right of kings. He stopped believing in papal authority. He stopped believing that human civilization was unique or special or chosen by God. He began to see history as a cycle. Civilizations rising from barbarism, achieving knowledge, destroying themselves, leaving fragments for the next cycle to discover. And he understood that the Templars had become guardians of proof that this cycle had already repeated at least once before. That 12,000 years ago, a civilization had risen to heights that medieval Europe could not imagine, that it had fallen, that it had left warnings, and that those warnings were being systematically ignored by institutions that preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. The manuscript ended with Guillaume's final entry, written in 1250, weeks before his death at Acre. He wrote that he had sent copies of the most important translations to 18 different Templar strongholds across Europe and the Middle East. He wrote that he had trained specific knights in the interpretation of the ancient scripts. And he wrote that he knew the order would eventually be destroyed because knowledge this dangerous could not be allowed to exist in the hands of men who might use it to challenge the power structures that controlled medieval Europe. Guillaume predicted the Templar Purge 57 years before it occurred. He predicted it would be orchestrated by a French king working in collaboration with the papacy. He predicted that most of the documentation would be destroyed. And he predicted that some would survive because he had made certain that survival was possible. He had created redundancy. He had hidden copies in locations that would take centuries to discover. And he had encoded the most vital information in plain sight, in architectural details of Templar churches, in the layouts of Templar fortifications, in manuscripts disguised as religious texts that would be preserved in monastery libraries, while the obvious records were burned. The 3 scholars who examined Guillaume's manuscript in 1987 attempted to publish their findings. They were prevented. Not through censorship, through more subtle means. Their funding was withdrawn, their academic positions were threatened, their reputations were systematically attacked by colleagues who had never read the manuscript, but who understood that its authentication would require rewriting significant portions of medieval history and Egyptian archaeology simultaneously. Two of the three scholars recanted their authentication. They claimed they had been mistaken. They published retractions stating that the manuscript was likely a modern forgery. The third scholar refused to recant. His name was Henri Moreau, a professor of medieval history at the Sorbonne. Henri insisted the manuscript was authentic. He insisted it proved the Templars had discovered evidence of a pre-Egyptian civilization. He insisted the academic establishment was suppressing this evidence deliberately. In 1993, Henri Moreau died of a heart attack at age 52. His personal research files disappeared from his office before his family could claim them. The manuscript itself vanished into Vatican archives where it remains today, unseen, unstudied, deliberately forgotten by institutions that understand perfectly well what its authentication would mean for the official narrative of human history. Friday, October 13th, 1307. Before dawn, in coordinated operations across 12 countries, soldiers acting under sealed orders broke down the doors of every Templar stronghold in Christendom. Within 6 hours, more than 15,000 knights, sergeants, and serving brothers were in chains. The operation was executed with military precision that required months of planning. Soldiers had been positioned days in advance. Lists of names had been prepared with meticulous accuracy. Even remote Templar farms and minor outposts were targeted simultaneously. This was not a spontaneous action driven by sudden discovery of heresy. This was systematic extermination planned by two men who understood that the Templars possessed knowledge too dangerous to be allowed to survive. King Philip IV of France and Pope Clement V had made a decision. The Knights Templar would cease to exist. The official charges were spectacular in their absurdity: denying Christ, spitting on the cross, worshipping an idol called Baphomet, obscene rituals performed in secret ceremonies, sexual perversion. These accusations were designed to be shocking enough to justify the arrests to a medieval population that understood religious crimes as the ultimate transgression. But anyone who examined the charges with minimal skepticism would recognize them as fabrications. The Templars had been the most devout military order in Christendom for 200 years. They had died by the thousands defending the Holy Land. They had built churches across Europe. They had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience that they honored more strictly than most monastic orders. The idea that these men had secretly been denying Christ for generations was preposterous. But the charges were not meant to be believable. They were meant to be useful. They provided legal justification for what was essentially political murder on an unprecedented scale. Philip IV had multiple motives that historians love to cite. He was bankrupt. He owed the Templars enormous sums of money. The Templar treasury in Paris contained wealth that exceeded the French crown's annual revenue. Seizing Templar assets would solve Philip's financial crisis instantly. These facts are true and well documented, but they are also incomplete. Philip was one of the most cunning political operators in European history. He had successfully challenged papal authority itself, forcing Pope Boniface VIII into submission through a combination of military threat and political manipulation. He was not a simple thief driven by greed. He was a strategist who understood power. And he understood that the Templars represented a threat that transcended their financial resources. They possessed knowledge that could destabilize the entire structure of medieval authority. And they had made the catastrophic mistake of letting him know it. In 1305, 2 years before the arrests, A Templar delegation met with King Philip in Paris. The meeting was documented in royal archives that survived the French Revolution. The Templars were attempting to negotiate new crusading funds. Philip was attempting to extract information about Templar financial operations. But at some point during the negotiations, the conversation shifted. One of the Templar delegates, attempting to demonstrate the order's importance and legitimacy, revealed information about their discoveries in Egypt. Not everything, but enough. He mentioned ancient manuscripts. He described chambers beneath Giza. He explained that the Templars possessed documentation proving that human civilization was far older than biblical chronology allowed. He thought this would impress Philip, would demonstrate that the Templars were serious scholars as well as warriors, would justify continued royal support for their operations. He was catastrophically wrong. Philip understood immediately what this knowledge represented. If the Templars could prove that the biblical timeline was false, they could challenge the Church's authority on fundamental questions about the nature of reality, about divine providence, about the legitimacy of Christian kingship itself. And if they possessed this proof in documentary form, if they had manuscripts and artifacts that could survive beyond the lifetimes of current Templar leadership, then the knowledge would eventually spread. It would reach universities. It would reach rival kingdoms. It would reach heretical movements already challenging papal authority. The implications were unacceptable. Philip made his decision within days of that meeting. The Templars had to be destroyed, not weakened, not reformed, completely annihilated as an organization, with every possible copy of their Egyptian documentation seized and burned. But Philip could not act alone. The Templars answered directly to papal authority. Only the Pope could dissolve a religious order. Only the Pope could authorize arrests of men who had taken holy vows. Philip needed papal cooperation, and Pope Clement V, elected in 1305 after Philip engineered the death of his predecessor, was a weak man controlled by French interests. Philip had placed him on the papal throne. Clement understood that his power depended on maintaining Philip's support. When Philip explained what the Templars possessed, when he described the threat this knowledge represented to church authority, Clement agreed to cooperation. The two men planned the extermination together. They coordinated the timing of arrests. They drafted the formal charges, and they made certain that the primary objective was not punishment for heresy, but seizure of documentation. The interrogations began within hours of the arrests. But these were not theological interrogations designed to assess guilt or innocence. These were intelligence operations designed to locate documents. Templars were tortured systematically, with one primary question repeated in every session. Where are the Egyptian manuscripts? Where are the artifacts? Where are the translations? Who has copies? Which strongholds contain archives? The confessions extracted under this torture were useless as evidence of heresy. But they were extremely useful as intelligence about Templar information networks. By December 1307, Philip's forces had identified and raided 37 separate document repositories. They seized thousands of manuscripts, and they burned them in coordinated fires that consumed centuries of accumulated knowledge in a single night. But Philip and Clement had made one critical miscalculation. They assumed that arresting the Templars would be straightforward, because the order operated openly, maintained documented strongholds, kept official records of membership. They did not account for the possibility that the Templars might have prepared for exactly this scenario, that Guillaume de Sonac's warnings written 50 years earlier might have been taken seriously, that the order might have created contingency plans for the eventuality of systematic persecution. The Templars had indeed prepared. They had identified members whose names did not appear in official records. They had established safe houses in locations not associated with the order. And most importantly, they had prepared ships. On the night of October 12, 1307, hours before the arrests began, 18 Templar galleys departed from the port of La Rochelle in western France. These ships were not part of the official Templar fleet. They were privately owned vessels crewed by sailors loyal to the order, but not members of it. They carried approximately 300 men, none of whom wore Templar mantles, none of whom could be identified as knights through any official documentation. And they carried cargo. Waterproofed chests containing the most important manuscripts from Templar archives, artifacts carefully packed in protective materials, copies of translations that Guillaume de Sonnac had made of the Egyptian inscriptions. Everything that could not be allowed to fall into Philip's hands. The ships disappeared into the Atlantic darkness. No official record documents their destination. No contemporary chronicle mentions their fate. They simply vanished from history. But there are clues. In 1309, 2 years after the arrests, Portuguese authorities reported unusual Templar activity in Lisbon. Knights who should have been imprisoned in France were spotted conducting business under assumed names. In 1311, Scottish records mention the arrival of ships carrying men who established themselves in remote highland regions and built fortifications. In 1314, the year the last Templar Grand Master was burned at the stake in Paris, Spanish chronicles describe mysterious vessels departing from Catalonian ports, carrying monks and cargo to unknown destinations. And in 1323, exactly 100 years after Bertrand de Blanchefort first descended into the Sphinx chambers, Egyptian sources record the arrival of European scholars who possessed maps to underground passages that local authorities did not know existed. The extermination of the Templars was thorough, but not complete. Philip seized the treasury. He burned the archives he could find. He tortured and executed the leadership. But he never recovered the Egyptian documentation. He never found the 18 ships. He never located the men who escaped with the knowledge that had condemned their order. And in his final years, Philip IV began to suspect that his victory was incomplete. Strange reports reached him from across Europe. Templar symbols appearing in new contexts. Former knights operating under different names. References in merchant documents to organizations that seemed to possess Templar knowledge and resources, but were not Templars officially. Philip died in 1314, less than 7 years after ordering the arrests, at age 46. The official cause was hunting accident, but contemporary physicians noted symptoms consistent with poisoning. His 3 sons died within 14 years, ending the direct Capetian dynasty. Medieval chroniclers whispered about the curse of Jacques de Molay, the Templar Grand Master who had cursed Philip from the flames. But perhaps it was not supernatural vengeance. Perhaps it was something more practical. The revenge of men who had lost everything except the knowledge that made them dangerous. In 2026, 719 years after the Templar extermination, the chambers beneath the Giza Plateau remain officially unexplored. Egyptian authorities cite structural concerns, preservation requirements, and respect for archaeological protocols as reasons why ground-penetrating radar surveys are prohibited in certain areas. Independent researchers who attempt to conduct unauthorized scans face immediate expulsion and permanent bans from Egyptian archaeological sites. The official explanation is protection of cultural heritage. But those who have studied the pattern of restrictions recognize something more deliberate. The areas where exploration is most strictly forbidden correspond precisely to the locations described in Guillaume de Sonac's manuscript: the entrance beneath the Sphinx, the passages connecting the three pyramids, the deep chambers that Templar knights descended into 800 years ago. These locations are not unexplored because archaeology lacks the technology to safely investigate them. They are unexplored because someone has decided that what they contain must remain hidden. The Vatican archives hold 53 linear miles of shelving. Official estimates suggest 10 million documents spanning 12 centuries of Catholic Church history. But these estimates account only for catalogued materials. There exist sections of the archives that appear in no public inventory, accessible only to cardinals with specific authorization, guarded by protocols that exceed security measures for any museum or government facility on Earth. Among these restricted sections, according to Vatican employees who have spoken anonymously to journalists, there exists a collection known internally as the Templar documentation. It occupies approximately 300 linear feet of shelving. It has never been digitized. It has never been photographed. Scholars who request access are told the materials are too fragile for examination. The truth, according to those same anonymous sources, is that the materials are perfectly preserved, but contain information the Church has decided cannot be made public without fundamentally undermining Catholic doctrine about human history and biblical chronology. In 1998, a French genealogist named Marie Dupont published research tracing certain aristocratic bloodlines back to the 13th century. Her work was meticulous, based on baptismal records, property transfers, and marriage contracts held in provincial archives across France. What made her research noteworthy was not the genealogies themselves, but what they revealed about survival patterns after 1307. Dupont documented 17 families whose ancestral records showed sudden name changes, geographic relocations, and acquisition of significant wealth during the period 1307 to 1320. These families had no documented source for their sudden prosperity. They appeared in new regions with resources that suggested substantial prior accumulation of capital, and their coat of arms, when examined carefully, contained subtle symbols that Templar scholars recognized as encoded references to the order. Dupont theorized these were families of escaped Templars who had rebuilt their lives under new identities. Her research was published in a limited academic journal. Within 6 months, every copy had been purchased by an anonymous buyer. Dupont herself received offers to discontinue her genealogical work in exchange for substantial financial compensation. She refused. In 2001, her research files were destroyed in a fire that authorities ruled accidental despite evidence of accelerant use. But Dupont's research survived in fragments. Other genealogists had read her work. They began conducting their own investigations, and what they discovered suggested that Templar descendants had not simply survived. They had prospered. They had infiltrated aristocratic families across Europe. They had maintained networks spanning centuries, passing information and resources through bloodlines that remained loyal to the Order's original mission, even after the organization itself had been destroyed. And most remarkably, they had preserved the Egyptian documentation. In 2014, an estate sale in Scotland included a medieval manuscript that authentication confirmed was written in 1320. The manuscript was a partial copy of astronomical calculations that matched descriptions in Guillaume de Sonac's 43-page document. It was purchased within hours by a private collector who immediately withdrew it from public view. But its brief appearance proved something crucial. The Templar documentation had not been completely destroyed. Copies existed. They had been preserved for 700 years, and they were still being actively protected by people who understood their significance. The question that historians refuse to ask publicly is why. Why would anyone maintain secrecy for 7 centuries? Why would descendants of medieval knights continue guarding manuscripts that describe events from the distant past? What purpose does this secrecy serve in the modern world? The answer becomes clear when you understand what acknowledgement would require. If the Templars actually discovered chambers beneath Giza containing proof of a civilization predating ancient Egypt, then the entire timeline of human history collapses. If those chambers contain artifacts demonstrating technological capabilities that ancient peoples supposedly did not possess, then our understanding of human development is fundamentally wrong. If the manuscripts the Templars found accurately predict future astronomical events through mathematical calculations, then we must accept that ancient builders possessed scientific knowledge that contradicts everything we teach about the progression of civilization. And if all of this is true, then institutions that have built their authority on specific narratives about human origins and historical development face an existential crisis. The Catholic Church teaches that human civilization began approximately 6,000 years ago with divine creation. This timeline is not incidental to Christian doctrine. It is foundational. It establishes humanity's relationship with God, explains the necessity of Christ's sacrifice, justifies the Church's role as intermediary between humanity and the divine. If human civilization is actually 12,000 years old, if advanced societies rose and fell before Adam was supposedly created, then Genesis becomes mythology rather than history. And if Genesis is mythology, then what else in Christian doctrine loses its claim to literal truth? The Church understands this perfectly well. This is why Vatican archives remain closed. This is why archaeological exploration of specific sites is prohibited. This is why researchers who attempt to investigate these questions face systematic obstruction. The knowledge itself is not dangerous, but acknowledgement of the knowledge would require institutions to admit they have been teaching demonstrably false information for 2,000 years. In 2019, ground-penetrating radar operated by a Japanese research team detected a massive void beneath the Sphinx. The void was approximately 30 feet below the surface, extending laterally for more than 200 feet. It matched descriptions from medieval documents of the chamber where Templars discovered astronomical charts. Egyptian authorities immediately halted the research project. They confiscated the radar data. They expelled the research team and banned the lead scientist from returning to Egypt. The official explanation was that the team had violated permit restrictions. But the scientist, speaking to journalists after his expulsion, explained that authorities became alarmed only after the radar results revealed the void's precise location and dimensions. They had not been concerned about permit violations when the research was producing results that matched accepted archaeological models. They became concerned when the evidence suggested something unexpected existed exactly where Templar manuscripts claimed it would be found. This pattern repeats across decades. In 1973, an American archaeologist attempted to explore passages beneath the Great Pyramid using remote cameras. His permit was revoked mid-project. In 1986, French engineers proposed using sonar to map underground voids across the entire Giza plateau. Their proposal was rejected without explanation. In 2004, a British documentary team requested permission to film inside chambers that Templar manuscripts described. They were denied access to those specific chambers while being granted access to others. The restrictions are not random. They are systematic. They target precisely the locations that medieval documents identify as containing evidence of pre-Egyptian civilization. And they are enforced with a consistency that suggests coordination between Egyptian authorities, academic institutions, and religious organizations that all share an interest in preventing certain discoveries from being confirmed. Yet the cracks are widening. Satellite imaging technology continues improving. Private researchers with significant funding can conduct surveys that government organizations cannot prevent. Ancient manuscripts continue surfacing in estate sales and private collections. And each new piece of evidence makes the official narrative more difficult to maintain. In 2023, declassified CIA documents revealed that American intelligence agencies conducted extensive investigations of the Giza Plateau in the 1960s using classified sensing technology. The documents confirmed the existence of unexplored chambers beneath the Sphinx. They described metallic anomalies detected at depths that should contain only limestone bedrock. And they noted that this information was shared with Vatican intelligence services and immediately classified at the highest security level. Why would the CIA and the Vatican collaborate to suppress archaeological information? What national security interest is served by keeping the public ignorant about ancient Egyptian chambers? The answer is not about Egypt. It is about control. It is about maintaining narratives that justify existing power structures. For 2,000 years, Western civilization has been built on specific assumptions about human history, about religious truth, about the relationship between past and present. These assumptions shape how people understand their place in the world, how they relate to authority, how they conceptualize progress and purpose. If those assumptions are demonstrated to be false, if human civilization is revealed to be cyclical rather than progressive, if ancient people possessed knowledge that modernity has barely begun to rediscover, then every institution that claims authority based on superior understanding faces delegitimization. The Templars discovered this truth in the 12th century. They were destroyed for possessing it. But the truth did not die with them. It was preserved. It was hidden. It was passed down through generations of guardians who understood that knowledge, once discovered, cannot be permanently suppressed. It can only be delayed. Somewhere, in private collections guarded by descendants of medieval knights, the Templar documentation still exists. Manuscripts describing what lies beneath the Egyptian sand. Translations of inscriptions that predate hieroglyphics. Drawings of artifacts that demonstrate impossible technological capabilities. And maps. Precise maps showing how to access chambers that official archaeology claims do not exist. These documents are waiting for a moment when humanity is ready to confront what they reveal. When institutions can no longer suppress evidence through intimidation and censorship. When technology makes verification impossible to prevent. That moment approaches. Satellite imaging improves yearly. Private space companies develop sensing capabilities that exceed government resources. Digital networks make information impossible to completely control. The secret that the Templars died protecting cannot remain buried forever. What sleeps beneath the pyramids will eventually awaken. And when it does, the comfortable lies that civilization has told itself about its origins will collapse under the weight of evidence that has been waiting in darkness for 12,000 years.